Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you. This topic of climate change and how we deal with it is something that I've spent a quarter of a century on. I first published a paper in 1991. So it's something where the problem has been, it looked fairly clear in 1991 and has become clearer, but finding the solutions is much more difficult. In terms of the Council, our role is to review the progress that Ireland and the government are making in tackling our climate goals, and to review policy and advise government on how best we can tackle this problem. And what we want to do is basically decarbonise Ireland, make sure that by 2050 Ireland is no longer having a negative impact on climate. And also our job is to try and see what pathway to decarbonisation there is which will impose least cost on Irish society. There are a number of other similar councils elsewhere. I believe you're interested in this topic. Probably smaller countries are more relevant. Like the United Kingdom has a council, but they have 40 people working for them, which is roughly the same as we have in proportion to population. But the problems and the way you interact with people, it's much easier to know somebody or to get something done or to find something out in a small country. So the Danish Council for us has been particularly useful because, as talking to them, because they also have a major agricultural sector that after Ireland in the EU, Denmark is the next biggest in terms of the agricultural emissions. The Dutch have a wider environmental remit. It's not just climate change. And as I said, the Danish one, they aren't concerned with adaptation. That's how we prepare to deal with the problems of climate change, which we also have responsibility for. In all cases, we advise government, and there are different ways we advise government. The legislation is different in each case, and now I think there's a new Swedish council being set up over the last year. But we are advisors. We don't make policy. And the composition of the councils tends to be experts. If you want people to make policy, then it's politicians you want. In terms of the membership, I show here, you'll see from different backgrounds, and you'll have seen it in the notes, so I won't go through and introduce us all. In terms of how we communicate our results, and policy making is far more complex than people think, oh, that's about ministers or it's about civil servants. Policy making in Ireland over the last 50 years, it involves a much broader group, and you are part now of this process, reflecting that it is the people of Ireland contribute in different ways to policy making. So how you communicate your answers, that it's no point coming up with a series of mathematical formulae which you send to an expert in the department. That isn't what it's about. You have to explain. So what we do, we want our advice to be firmly grounded in evidence. So we may think that something's the right answer, but we want to, if we advise government, to be reasonably certain that it is the right answer. Everything we do is published. So our advice isn't secret, it is published. It's available to you as well as to ministers and civil servants. We produce formal reports. We published in what was called a periodic report in July, and this is where we bring together our advice across a range of different areas. We also write to the Minister on particular topics, and we engage with departments. On behalf of the Council, I come and speak to you. So there are a range of different ways one communicates our best understanding of what the approach in Ireland should be. And all reports and correspondence are available on our website. You've heard now over 2 weekends that the world faces a major problem, and the changes are happening now. But this is a policy problem unlike any other that certainly I've had to deal with, because it's going to play out over decades, over a century. Normally, what happens is you have a problem. and you say, right, we need to do something about that, and we're going to have to pay something, it's going to cost some people, but there is a benefit for you, the electorate, you, the people of Ireland, from making these changes, and you should go and do it. The problem in climate change is, yes, there are going to be costs for us all, and we see examples which may be caused by climate change of damage to us, but the problems are going to be much worse for my children. They're going to be much worse for my grandchildren. I'll be dead before things really get bad as a result of climate change. So what we are doing is we're asking ourselves to make changes today which aren't really going to benefit us. There will be some benefits in terms of health, in terms of air quality, in terms of warmer homes, but the real benefits will come to future generations. And this is a very difficult problem it's difficult for us in terms of advising and policy. It's particularly difficult for politicians because it is really an ethical question where you're asking people to do something which is not for them. And politicians are not comfortable with preaching in terms of ethics. Actually, the Pope had a very good encyclical last year where he was speaking not to Catholics, not to Christians, to the people of the world. In terms of how we must make changes. Now, his economics wasn't as good as his ethics, but I'll come on to that. That's why I'm here. Just to summarise that over the next 50 years, we have to stop using carbon-based fuels, which requires massive change. And the fact that every unit of carbon dioxide we emit today will be still in the atmosphere in 10,000 years' time means that the sooner we take action, the better. And making changes will affect all aspects of our lives. So we are being asked to make big changes over the coming decade, as I said, which will affect how we travel, how we heat our homes, and also indirectly. How do we communicate this message? First of all, the science is well understood, but the answer is not simple. There isn't a silver bullet. I heard a lecture recently and they talked about silver buckshot, that there are a whole range of different things. So what you're going to vote on, I'm not quite sure. But there isn't a single solution, a yes-no answer. Also, in terms of the political system, there's huge distractions. There are so many other problems going on. And you can always postpone climate change because this is going to play out over such a long period. So politicians are only human, and to get them to focus for any length of time on this issue is very difficult when we, the people of Ireland, are asking them to focus on so many other issues. Also, how we communicate the need for change. We're humans, and we behave in complex ways. So there isn't a single go out and do it and say, oh, I'm going to make a big change, but you get distracted, you go off, you have to live your life. So that the ability also to absorb information. When I go to the supermarket and I buy a pound of butter, it's €2.19, and I know it's going to be bad for me. Is there more information I need to know? Food miles and so on, that there's only so much information that we in our daily lives can absorb and deal with. So you need to communicate the message in a reasonably simple way. And that's one of the reasons why the market is useful. And I'm going to come back to this. If the price is higher, then we tend to say, buy something else or do something different. It is a simple way of sending a message to people. However, the market is imperfect. That we all, like when we buy our electricity or mobile phones or whatever, it's so complex working out what's the cheapest. There are other reasons why we change. So communicating how we need to change is not easy. The challenge, I show just one graph, and in the blue line at the top, it shows where we're going. That it is now clear we are going to miss our target by 2020, and I think we're going to miss it by even more than the government expects, because they're basing some of their work on work which I actually did before I retired in the SRI in 2013, 2014, and I know that we underestimated the recovery in the economy. So I think the problem is, if anything, bigger. And we're going to miss the target. And the way things are going, unless we change, it's the blue line. Emissions are going to rise in the future unless we introduce new policies. So that's why new policies, different policies which are going to make a difference, we need to move from the blue line to, if you like, the orange line going down. We just show it going down in a straight line. It could be a bumpy line. It would be nicer if we could go down more rapidly. But what the best strategy is, we have to think about, the government have to think about, but we have to change. The government published their National Mitigation Plan in July, and we welcomed its publication. And the fact that the government met for a day out to consider climate change with one other issue was a sign that they were actually taking this issue seriously. And also the plan involves a number of ministers are signed up to it. However, my school reports always said could do better. And I'm not sure whether it motivated me, but our view is the government could do better. We, the people of Ireland, could do better. So whether the government reacts as I did, being rather cross with the report, but probably going out and working harder, we need to work harder, as we won't achieve the 2020 targets. And it's not just about 2020. Because if we were to get down to having no impact on the climate by 2050, we've got, the longer you delay taking the action, the more expensive it is going to be for Ireland to make the change. So it's really urgent that we begin the task. It is possible that there are ways of out of our obligations 2020 in the sense that we can pay other countries who've overperformed. But that isn't the issue, because, or that isn't necessarily even the cost-efficient solution, because you'll then have an even bigger cliff, or not cliff, mountain, rather than a cliff, to climb afterwards. So that is the fact that we're not going to hit 2020 means that we are a very long way towards our targets for 2030, 2050. Another problem for policymakers and for us all is that we don't know actually the road to 2050 to where we want to get. We need to consider a number of different pictures, lay out for ourselves, and it's important to think of this because if, for example, we go for electric cars, and that looks like being part of the way we're going to deal with this problem, what happens if electricity is still being produced with coal? So we need to map out, if we're going with electric cars, we need electricity to no longer be produced with carbon fuels by 2050. So we need to, but maybe it might be that it'll be hydrogen-powered cars, I don't know for certain, although it's looking increasingly like electric cars. So we need to map out, and the government needs to map out maps to the future, which shows the complexity of it and brings together all the different bits. In terms of our recommendations, firstly, we need policy decisions, and there are lots of very good ideas in the National Mitigation Plan, but no decisions. So that is a big gap. We also need to look at the experience. We have implemented policies already. Some of them worked and some of them didn't. And we shouldn't be afraid of failure, but we should learn from failure and build on that. One of the clear messages from us as a council is you need an effective price signal. The government needs to take account in its investment planning, and I'll come back to this, of the fact that emitting carbon is expensive, that it's going to damage the world. So we need also a forward guidance on carbon tax. What the government's plans are out to 2030. It's going to rise if we're going to make any difference. We need a reform of the EU emissions trading system, which sets the price of carbon in electricity. And these signals are needed to guide us at where we want to go. We also should remove the fossil fuel, or the subsidy on which we all pay on our electricity bills to peat. It doesn't make sense to be burning peat, which is the most damaging fuel to make electricity, and subsidising it. Now, if we close peat, we then have to take account of the fact there are people working there, so that enabling a just transition is important. The public expenditure, one of the limited gains which we made, when the government published the draft plan, we said, look, the public expenditure framework matters. That is how you decide on investment priorities. You need to change and take account of climate change in that. And at the current way they do it, they're not paying enough attention to it. And I said that to the Minister on behalf of the Council. The Minister said, I'll talk to Pascal. He talked to Pascal, and 2 weeks later, the government announced they were going to change it. So that was a small but significant win. The distributional implications. one of the things which is really important is that to understand that there are going to be costs, and some people are going to end up paying a higher share of the costs than others, and it needs to be a fair transition. People on low income spend a higher share of their income on electricity, on heating, than people living in Aylesbury Road or Shrewsbury Road. So that is a problem. And actually research published by a colleague of mine in the SRI in 1992 said you will need to spend 30% approximately of the revenue you take in tax in increasing welfare payments to compensate those at the bottom who are going to be big losers. So that's another reason you need the tax, because you need the revenue to compensate losers. Losers is a bad word, but people who are going to be adversely affected, shall we say, that would be more in style with an economist's phrasing of it. And we need to change behaviour. Transport, you heard yesterday, increasing public transport, supporting incentives for electric vehicles. I was interested to see in Glenties now in Donegal, you can plug in your electric car on the main street. We have developed the technology. All we need is the electric cars, and electric cars that can get us from Dublin to Glenties without having to stop along the way. We also need to rebalance spending from roads to public transport, although we will still need roads. And in terms of developing the way we do our work so that people can live closer to where they work, so they can walk or cycle, so we become less dependent on cars. You heard yesterday from, I think, a number of people on the agricultural area, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. We need to define what the objective is for agriculture by 2050, which has not yet been done. We will have to reduce our emissions in the case of agriculture. And a really important thing, and this is something which the government also changed between the draft and the final plan published in July, we need to consider land use. It's not just agriculture. Because if, for example, we produce less beef cattle and we use the land for something else, if we use the land for forestry or in ways that suck carbon out of the atmosphere, you have a win-win. So we need to look at ways of using our land better. In a way that actually contributes to the solution of global warming. So the government in the final plan said, yes, land use we need to consider. A success story is renewable electricity. The way we incentivized it was we said there's a guaranteed price for renewable electricity. So we've delivered a lot of wind-powered electricity in Ireland, and we want to get to 40% by 2020, and we may well do so. And that guarantee was financed for our electricity bills. I think, I just checked my bill, I think it's about, including VAT, it's about €80 a year I'm paying. This has been used partly to subsidise renewable electricity. But a study shows that up to 2012, yes, we paid the subsidy. It was a higher electricity in our electricity bill, but the cost of the electricity actually fell because wind comes, it doesn't cost you anything when the wind blows to generate electricity. So actually, renewable electricity meant the people of Ireland in their electricity bills were paying less than before. So that's a win-win. Are there ways, and that's our job as a council to advise the government, are there ways we can actually do this in a smart way that not, in some cases, may actually save us money? So that is one case of a success. Why we believe a carbon tax is important, it sends, as I said, a simple signal to us. The government also gets the revenue. We need the revenue to compensate people who are going to be very badly affected by action on climate change. And the rest of the money, if we used it to reduce other taxes which are damaging to employment, actually we could be actually better off. There's actually a win-win there in what you do with the revenue. We don't like paying taxes, but if you use the taxes wisely in terms of reducing our emissions, in terms of using it other ways, we can actually be better off. But more important than the rise in the price is it sends a signal to business all over the world. If you can find ways of us living our lives without damaging the climate, you will make money. And that is, and we've seen it in electric cars. Why are people developing electric cars? Because companies think they can make money out of it. So that is why raising the price of emitting carbon is very important, because people will invest in research and in technologies that will actually help us live the lives we want to live without having to, and not damage the climate. So that's really important. Today we pay a carbon tax of 20 euros a tonne, which is around the average of the countries that have introduced it. I showed there what the effect is on a bag of coal or on briquettes. But we need a much higher price. It should be 35 to 70 euros rather than 20. The EU emissions trading scheme, I'm not going to go into the complexity of this, but basically it should make the cost of using coal or peat to make electricity much more expensive, but it has so far been a failure. And the EU, and the first thing we did as a council was write to the minister and say, encourage the government to support a French proposal which would have given a minimum price for burning fossil fuels in electricity generation across Europe. And we feel this is important because if we electrify our cars and if we electrify our heat, but if electricity is still polluting, then we have a problem. So we need to have mechanisms which guarantee to the people of Ireland and the people of Europe that electricity will be carbon neutral by 2050. We're human, and we're not just driven by markets and prices. For example, poorer households are unable to invest in insulating their homes. There are probably many cases of, say, a widow living up a valley in Kerry, aged 80, using peat to heat her house. She's probably cold. The fumes from the peat probably aren't good for her health. But to introduce insulation into that home, which could actually, it'd save her money, but it's going to be very difficult. So finding ways to make it easy for us to do things which may also have other benefits for us are important. And the price signal is not going to influence that person. Public transport and denser development, less commuting, that's a way we change our behaviour without necessarily being driven by price. But this easy issue of it's not just widows in Kerry. It's myself. 5 years ago, my wife said we need to put in a downstairs shower so when we're disabled or older, we will be able to still live in the house. Now, it caused chaos in putting this in. And it didn't cause divorce. We're married 45 years still. But the chaos in the house, and in the end, I look at my gas bill, and yes, it saved 30%. And the cost of doing this chaos in the house, actually, it saved me money. But the reason why I didn't do it before, why we didn't do it before, was because my wife hadn't kicked me into doing it. The reason was because of the disruption. So this is not just about price. There are a range of other things we've got to do to help us make the changes we need to do. In conclusion, I think that of all the policy problems, it is the biggest, it is different from all the others, because I said at the earlier that certainly not me, some of the younger people in the room will benefit significantly if we can halt climate change. But it's for future generations. We have to cut our emissions the objective is to 80% of where they were before by 2050. Leadership and strategy is needed. And the problem is with so many other demands on the political system, getting leadership and developing a strategy, there are so many distractions. And that's why you are important, what you say, that the people are actually going to listen to what you say and help focus our minds on tackling this problem. Currently, Ireland is a laggard, not a leader. So the question which you were asked, the top level question of how can we become a leader? Well, we've got a long way to go before we can become a leader, because we're going to be one of only 3 or 4 countries in Europe to miss our target for 2020. It is only when we are outperforming and finding new innovative ways of tackling the problem that we will come out and say we are a leader. But there are ways which, like in terms of renewable electricity, what has been achieved here has been significant, and there are lessons for others in this area. The National Mitigation Plan is only a beginning. And the problem is the hard decisions have not really been taken in that. And we need, in terms of a carbon tax, one simple mechanism is to increase the carbon tax. But there, it's not even a question. We publish our reports because we're not just communicating to the minister, to the government. The problem is, if a carbon tax is to pass in the next budget, it needs the opposition to buy into it. It needs the opposition parties. Unless they support it, the government can't get a budget through now without the Oireachtas voting on it. So we need a buy-in. So we publish our reports, we communicate to a much wider audience, because the policy-making community has to say, yes, this is vital. And finally, Ireland must work with the EU and the UN. And I have not talked about the EU's targets for us. They are our targets for us. And the EU are how we will help to implement this. And particularly, for example, in the area of electricity, why the EU is so important. If we went ahead and raised the price of electricity dramatically in Ireland, it would make business uncompetitive. It might be the right thing to do, but it would make business lose out in the rest of Europe. But if Europe does it for Europe, then we're not losing compared to our competitors. We are all going to work towards finding a solution to the problem of climate change. So that's why, at an EU level, our participation in that, they are part of our solution. They are not driving us. We are part of that. And similarly, the Paris Agreement in the United Nations, the UN agreement, was huge progress, where the world has bought in. And I travel to babysit in the United, or my grandson says it's kids sit actually in the United States. Fortunately, a long way to go to see your grandchildren. But even with Trump, you see changes there. So I am hopeful that the world has turned a corner. We have a long way to go. Thank you.